Order, order. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this public evidence session of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We are joined this morning by a couple of colleagues from committees outside our own membership. We're joined by the Chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, Tonia Toniatsa, and John Glenn, member of the Treasury Select Committee. This morning we are going to be scrutinising the potential impacts of the proposed changes to agricultural property relief and business property relief on the farming sector as part of our recently launched inquiry into the future of farming. We have two panels of witnesses today, and we shall be pushing hard to get as much information into a relatively short period of time as possible. So, as is always the case, less is more on these occasions. Brevity is appreciated. For my own part, I would simply remind the committee and those observing our proceedings of the declarations previously made to this committee, and also those included in my entry in the Register of Members' Financial Interests. Gentlemen, good morning. You'll see we've not incurred too much taxpayers' money on keeping the committee room warm for you this morning rather. But can I ask you, first of all, for the benefit of the meeting and for the official record, to introduce yourselves. Perhaps we'll just start on the left here and work along the panel.
Good morning, I'm David Sturrock. I'm a Senior Research Economist at the Institutes for Fiscal Studies.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Aaron Advani. I'm an Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Warwick, and I'm Director of the Centre for the Analysis of Taxation.
Jeremy Moody, Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, representing, qualifying and briefing some 3,000 of those advising farmers and owners and others across the whole United Kingdom.
Permanent Secretary Catherine Little. This is 2 weeks, 2 shows, so we are forging that good relationship with the Cabinet Office, which we were determined as a committee to have. And again, thank you so much for coming to join us this afternoon, forgive me. I think the two main topics, Chancellor, that we want to go over with you today is missions, the whats, the whys and the wherefores, and civil service. Issues, and if we've time, we will wish to touch on intergovernmental relations as well. But I'm going to sort of kick off, if I may, on the missions. Every government coming in will use some sort of language which says this is how we're going to deliver things. It's a mission. It's a whatever it may happen to be. Could you just give us a feeling, as it were, as to whether you think a machinery of government reshuffle is required to help deliver the missions, given how very siloed Westminster and Whitehall is? So that's your sort of starter for 10.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. I'll do my best to answer the committee's questions over the period of time that we have. To begin with missions, the idea was to have some big long-term aims, as well as managing the day-to-day stuff that any government has to manage. A government has to operate, if you like, at more than one speed. There's always events, as was famously said. There is the famous government grid. There will be international engagements that a Prime Minister has to do. There's weekly Prime Minister's questions and so on. And it's very easy to feel incredibly busy all the time and to deal with all the urgent things. But there's a difference between the urgent and the important. I'm not saying those short-term things aren't important, but we felt before the election it was good to have a number of big long-term aims, and that's why we had these missions around the economy, the health service, opportunity, crime and clean power. And in terms of machinery of government, you're right that there's a lot of Whitehall DNA around departments. That's traditionally the way spending's worked, and these departments have a very enduring identity. It's remarkably enduring, actually, despite changes of political colour of the party in power and obviously changes of Secretary of State. So we are trying to do something that's quite ambitious here, which is to get them to work across those departmental lines to deliver these long-term missions, and to make sure that in between the urgent there is a drumbeat of work that's aimed towards the long term. And the architecture that we set up at the beginning of this Parliament was to have a number of mission boards, each of which is chaired by the relevant Secretary of State, who's the mission lead and is in charge of delivering their mission. I serve on them all alongside the chairs. We established a mission delivery unit inside the Cabinet Office, which works with the different mission leads in each of the departments. And then the Prime Minister chairs stock takes with each of the mission leads to drive progress as well. And in between that, there's a lot of informal contact. There's my own bilateral meetings with the Prime Minister. And that is essentially the architecture that we've set up to drive it.
The mission boards, how is the government intending to have sort of transparency and accountability on those? Will memberships of them be in the public domain and revised as and when they change? Will we know what the agendas are? Will we know what matrix they're using to measure success, progress and failure?
Oh, you'll know the metrics of a lot of the metrics were set out in the plan for change that we published last week.
I have a copy here,
which we may come to. So the metrics certainly, in terms of attendance, that might vary depending on the subject under discussion. Location might also vary, because one of my messages to all the mission leads is this isn't just a Whitehall exercise. Let's get out of Whitehall. Let's speak to all the expertise there is around the country. So we won't always say the mission board is meeting today and here's who's coming, but the goals are public. The goals for this Parliament were published last Thursday, so it's clear what they're trying to do.
And are the boards a replacement of or ancillary to the traditional cabinet committees?
They're not a replacement for the traditional cabinet committees. We have cabinet committees, a Home and Economic Affairs cabinet committee and so on, that deals with the day-to-day business of government. Their work carries on as normal.
So who's the ringmaster? Is it you? Do you hold both the carrot and the stick in this increasingly siloed Whitehall that we all know about?
The Prime Minister is ultimately the ringmaster always, but Prime Ministers are
busy people.
Very busy people.
He's delegated to you, effectively,
and
hasn't
so
he?
On a day-to-day basis, he has asked me to coordinate and drive this work. But I do stress there was a decision taken to have these boards chaired by the mission leads to make sure they were accountable for delivering their mission. It wouldn't be the right thing to do to just relieve the departments of their responsibilities and locate it all in the Cabinet Office. We have an important coordinating role. We can chase, we can ask questions, we can challenge, but the actual delivery and the bulk of staff and so on are in the departments themselves. Sorry.
You can't tell. You can't instruct.
Well, ultimately, the Prime Minister can. Yeah.
And so is that power of instruction also delegated to you?
Look, if there was a dispute, it would be elevated to the biggest authority in government, which is the Prime Minister. We prefer to work in a collaborative way, but ultimately the reason we have stock takes is with the Prime Minister is precisely so that he can press, are we going far enough, fast enough here? I want more information there. What is your plan to get to this? That is what the function of those meetings is.
The Prime Minister said recently that mission government will, and I quote, change the accountability incentives in government. What did he mean by that?
He meant that when you set out big long-term goals like we did last Thursday, it's clear what the direction of travel should be, and so people really now know what their aim is over the next 5 years.
Yes, but how does that incentivise accountability?
Well, if you're the Secretary of State for X and you've got an aim in this document, you know the Prime Minister is instructing you to do everything you can to deliver it.
And do you see any merit in and I appreciate for some machinery of government reshuffles are just, changing the brass plate on a door, but do you see any merit, you're a few months into government, any merit at all in a fundamental review of how the machinery of Whitehall looks? Because I think there's an anxiety, if I can put it this way, of trying to retrofit a new way of delivering government and policy from an old machine.
Yeah, well, look, I can't say never to that because you never know what, a Prime Minister might decide to do on machinery of government, but we came into office without the intention of tearing up the departmental structures. I'm one of the few people in this government that served in the last one.
Indeed, with distinction, I think.
There's not very many of us because we were out of power so long. So most ministers are new, we've got some collective experience, but not a huge amount of the past. And machinery of government changes. They might have their fans, they might have their sceptics. On the sceptical side, you could argue that they can take up a lot of energy, they can take up a lot of heat, they cause a lot of friction, people get very preoccupied about the new name, the new identity,
yes,
the new this or that. Do you really want to do that, or do you want to focus the energy of the system on the outcomes? And we took the latter view, that we should focus on the outcomes. Does that mean the departmental structure will always stay forever exactly as it is? Of course I can't say that, but we didn't come into government intending to do a lot of machinery of government changes. There was a bits and pieces. For example, you said we were maybe going to touch on intergovernmental relations later in the session. That was a function that was in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government.
Yes, indeed.
And it was one of those situations where I think I'm right in saying it was under the previous administration, but the reason it was there was it was a personnel decision. It was because Michael Gove was the Secretary of State, and he was judged, for totally understandable reasons in my view, to be a Secretary of State with experience and standing in that field of intergovernmental relations. This Prime Minister took the view that the natural home for that function probably wasn't that ministry, but was back in the centre of government at the Cabinet Office. So there's been some movement of functions, but not a wholesale redrawing of departments.
You talked there about sort of energy to deliver. How much delivery energy can one find in a tepid bath?
Well, I think the systems don't always focus on delivery as much as they should. There's a lot of process, and there's processes there for a reason. People like to do things properly. What I think the Prime Minister was saying in using that phrase was, let's focus on delivery and focus on outcomes. And that's very much the spirit of the document that he published last week.
Thank you. Two more quick questions from me. Just one back on the missions board. Is it just ministers who sit on the board, or is it populated with officials and external
officials too, and people can be invited in. I'm keen to have these things open to outside expertise. So it's not just ministers. Ministers are there, but there are others too.
Okay. And let me ask you this almost sort of philosophical question. You referenced you were a minister under Gordon Brown, actually quite a long time ago when you think of it.
I know.
What has it been a shock as to how Whitehall now works, how the world of work and policy delivery has changed these last 14 years? And is there anything that you found where you thought, dear God, I thought they would have finished doing that by now, and it's still on the agenda?
It hasn't really been a shock. There we are.
Well, you're a very sanguine man, aren't you? You don't get shocked easily.
There we are. Look, a lot has changed. I mean, my goodness, since 2010, when the last Labour government left office, most obviously the two biggest things have been Brexit and then the experience of the pandemic. I think they both had obviously big influence on government and what it did. When we left office in 2010, we were just coming out of the great financial crisis. An awful lot's changed, and the country's a very different place. Technology has changed massively, and I think that I made a speech yesterday about how that should change the functions of government. But a lot of the Whitehall processes are still quite familiar.
I'm going to turn to Lauren now, I think.
I've got one more question before I get to that one. If that's all right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a quick question about...
Just a little bit, I'm going to go to Lauren, then I'm going to go to Luke, and then I'm going to Charlotte.
Just a quick question on, I guess, achieving the outcomes of those missions. Obviously, as a government, you can set the missions and you obviously have a huge role in implementing them. But I'm quite conscious, I come from a local government background. They are on the pointy end of actually making a lot of this stuff happen, particularly when you're talking about growing the economy and having that across the regions. How are you planning to work with local government in particular, as well as the private sector, as well as the devolved authorities, to really make sure that you're achieving everything that you want throughout the UK?
Well, they're challenging to achieve. It's the first thing to say. They're not easy. This isn't like me running my Saturday morning park run and saying, won't I be doing great if I can do it in less than 30 minutes? These are challenging things to do. I would like to think they are the country's missions, not just the government's. We have a national challenge on waiting lists. We have a national challenge on not having built enough homes for many, many years, and so on. So we definitely need the buy-in, the support, the partnership, the expertise of others to do that. Local government and mayors are very important. I think the great advantage, I know local government's under a lot of financial pressure, and that narrows the options. But at its best, local government, the great advantage of it is it can be innovative and creative and show you ways to do things that maybe haven't been done elsewhere. And one of the things I was saying in the speech I made yesterday about reform of the state was this idea of test and learn, of not always doing policy the traditional Whitehall way of the white paper, national implementation, all at once, but actually taking an idea, developing it, testing it, possibly with some failure at first. And people are scared of failure, partly because they'll be come in front of a committee like this and people will say, why did you let that fail? Why didn't that project work? But we have to have a bit more tolerance of that if we're going to develop things in the right way, because human life is complex, and getting very clever people at the centre to always design it perfectly doesn't always work. And if you look at the way that products and services have developed in the private sphere, particularly with services and technological companies, this idea of test, learn, fail, develop, make it better in real time is embedded, and it's very innovative and creative. So that's what we want to do, and that's why yesterday I announced a few of these projects which are in partnership with local authorities.
Maybe Charlotte.
Yes. Let's go to Luke now, and then I'll come to Charlotte. Luke Taylor.
So we've spoken a little bit about the machinery of government. We've talked about, you've outlined the mission boards, the delivery units, and how the mission leads and the boards fit together. The Prime Minister talked about rewiring the British state. So we've got lots of mechanical descriptions of things there. What other changes do you anticipate to have to make, or is that going to be as a result of seeing whether anything continues to work or not?
Well, I think the test and learn idea is an interesting one that I was just speaking to Ms. Edwards about. And some of this has been done. One of the examples I spoke about yesterday was the universal credit system. This was a story of two halves. When the idea was first mooted in government, it was very difficult to get off the ground, and they burned through a lot of money without making much progress, and they had to stop and, to use another term of the moment, reset, and they took it away from its usual circumstances. They set up a small team of about 30 people, which included policymakers, IT people, frontline workers, and they started really, really small instead of trying to do it all at once. And they took it very step by step, learning as they went, and so you had a very gradual rollout. And then in the pandemic, when the system was under a lot of pressure instantly, it performed very well. Now, you can always have a debate, and maybe a political debate in this House, about how much the benefit should be. That's fine, but as a mechanical system of getting money to people, they developed a system that worked well under great pressure during the pandemic. So I just use that as an example of something. Another one is the passport service, which works extremely well. But again, a few years ago, some of you are new MPs.
We had urgent question after urgent question after urgent question.
Those of us who were in the House some years ago, it was very creaky, and our constituency offices were under siege from people who couldn't get a passport in time to go on holiday, and they rebooted and reorganised the service. And actually, sometimes now you hear people use it, and it's a sort of backhanded compliment, because people will have a certain perception of what using a public service will be, and they'll use the passport service and they'll say, do you know what? It was really good. And there's a slight tone of surprise, which is a shame. And I would like that tone to be seen in more public service. And the truth is, there's too many things in the country that aren't working properly at the moment. So I'm keen, you asked me what other changes. What I'm keen to foster is a culture of curiosity about why some things work well and why others don't, and to learn from the ones that work well. I think curiosity is a real duty of those involved in public life, to learn in that way.
Does that curiosity then extend to trying things and allowing them to fail, and then learning from them and improving?
I believe it should. I think we need a greater risk appetite. There's a lot of things that militate against a greater risk appetite. One could argue the structure of being hauled before select committees sometimes does, because people will say, why did that project fail? But that's part of our democratic accountability. Another example on risk appetite is the previous government set up ARIA, and that channels funds for research, and it was deliberately designed to have a greater risk appetite and probably a greater risk of failure. And the reason it was done like that was because when you're engaged in cutting edge research, if you only bet on the absolute safe bets, you will never find the new discovery. So it's absolutely sensible in circumstances like that to build a risk appetite into it.
And just on that, is your assessment that you're able to foster a risk appetite and that inquisitiveness that you spoke of a moment or so ago, with very, very detailed, experienced people, or from what has been a general trend of moving away from expertise in the civil service and buying that in on an ad hoc basis and relying upon the enthusiastic generalist?
That's an old debate, this, isn't it? The enthusiastic generalist. Look, I don't want to... How can I put it?
I mean, I'm never entirely convinced it's one or the other. I think you should have both.
Yeah, it's a very old debate. That one of the other things, sorry to keep referring to this speech I made yesterday, but...
We will all go out to Chancellor and buy a copy of this speech.
We can get one for free, actually. I talked about this notion of a tour of duty. And it's not, again, there has been a programme already, but in a very small scale about this, about innovation fellows. And the idea is to ask people to come in for a 6 to 12 month period and perhaps help us crack a problem. They don't have to have a whole career in the civil service. It doesn't have to be that life-changing, right, that's what I'm going to do for the next 10, 20 years. But to come in for a short period. And one of the challenges we have is, particularly in the tech world, is salaries and what people can earn outside compared to what they can earn inside. But I would like to appeal to the public-spirited nature of people who could help us solve some projects that deliver for the public. And I think there are people out there who do want to do good for the country. I'm not saying they're going to work for free, but they don't have to make a whole career of it. So I think this idea of a tour of duty is one that we should use.
I agree with you. Can I just ask you one thing that flows from that, which is the ACOBA rules often mean that those public service motivated people who say, fine, there's a nut that needs cracking. A cabinet office or a secretary of state reaches out, can you come and help us? We understand you've got expertise, commercial expertise or whatever. Yes, of course, I'd love to. And of course they've got inside knowledge because they've been working within a department. And ACOBA says, of course, you can't go back to the day job once you've finished because you have specialised knowledge and you have to have everything cleared and there has to be breathing space and all the rest of it. In order to get that tour of duty, there needs to be some changes to ACOBA, surely.
Well, let me bring Kat Little, the Permanent Secretary, on this because, as I say, this has been tried in a small way, these innovation fellows, before.
Yeah. So I think there is a general point about ACOBA can be a massive deterrent to people coming in, and that's on the assumption that people understand exactly how the rules impact on them. I think there's a lot more that we need to do to explain it, but I think we need to make sure that there are exit strategies and that the terms and the conditions are clear up front, and that is what we do with the innovation fellowships. Is they're not coming in on full civil service terms and conditions. We're creating secondments, we're creating bespoke arrangements so that there's a clear exit path and a clear understanding of the difference of the role. So expanding it, yes. Looking again at how we define the rules, yes.
We have a note on that in due course. That would be very helpful. Charlotte Kane.
Yes, so I wanted to go back to the test and learn idea, which I think is an interesting idea. How are the teams going to be made up? Are they going to have junior and senior staff and external people?
That's the idea. So the Chancellor announced a budget of £100 million, so an innovation fund to fund these projects. I announced a few yesterday based around the twin problems or twin challenges of temporary accommodation and family hubs. And the idea is you do have policy people and practitioners and technology and also the users of the service as well, because that's who it's all for, to help design, help crack these problems, see if we can do this better, and you use the experience as Miss Edwards said, of local government, some of our mayors and some local leaders as well, because they know their area better than anyone. Those are just the first couple, but there'll be more of these going forward. And my colleague, Minister Georgia Gould, works a lot on this idea, and this is just the early stages of it.
And will they have different rules to the standard civil service rules, financial regulations, governance? Will they be able to move
They'll
quickly?
still have to obviously account for public money and so on, but I think when you start this, you will realise that it won't always work at once. You know, they may get something wrong, but if something's going to go wrong, I'd rather it went wrong in a small way than a huge way. And also, the cost of the status quo is often very high. There's a huge amount of money spent collectively around the country on temporary accommodation. Now, are we getting the system right? Can we improve that system? Let's try this project and find out.
So you touched on the fact that some of these will fail. How are you going to bed in the acceptance of that from the minister all the way through, that the project failing is about learning the lessons from it rather than a failure, and it shouldn't have therefore been done?
Well, that is the basic concept from the get-go. There's been a lot of talk of Elon Musk in recent months, and he says that every time one of the rockets blows up in space, they learn a huge amount. They learn, exactly what went wrong, how to fix it for next time. Not everything works first time.
But how are you going to embed that? How are you going to convince the staff in particular that they are going to be assessed on how they went about it, the lessons learned, what it can lead to in future, rather than assessed on the fact it didn't succeed?
They know from the beginning that that's the idea behind it. You're testing and learning. And failure isn't a final thing. It's just the way you did it that time didn't work. And so you can improve the way you did it for next time, hopefully.
I hear that, but how are you making sure that the more junior staff are convinced by that?
Well, it should be the spirit of the team that they're working in.
Could I perhaps just add to that? So I think it's my responsibility to make sure that that is the case across the whole of the civil service. And it's a combination of culture, tone set at the top by our political leaders, and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster is entirely right. We set that clarity out front, but it's got to be backed up by performance management, really great line management training. So we set standards for line managers across government. We need to build it into the way in which they coach, mentor and support staff. Now that takes a bit longer in a kind of an organisation with the complexity and size that we are. So for the Cabinet Office, we've got to make sure that there's process through performance management, the incentives, and that people understand the training and the line management expectations for this.
And then when you've got these various projects that have happened, and you've learnt lessons, good and bad, how are those lessons going to be shared more widely around the civil service?
Well, if they manage to deal with the two challenges they've been set in different places, these are not in the same place, then obviously you try and replicate that elsewhere. But again, one of the things to remember here is not every area of the country is the same either. They have their own characteristics and so on. So, it's not always a case of taking it like a cookie cutter and just putting it elsewhere. But if we get success and we think we can save money or get a better outcome, or hopefully a combination of the two, then we'll try and replicate it elsewhere.
Sorry, where you don't get success, but there are still lessons to learn. But there are still lessons to learn.
Of course.
How are those going to be shared around?
Well, people will know what went wrong and why it didn't work. They say failure's a good teacher, so we should learn from failure as well as success.
Just two things I'd add. We have an evaluation community across government, so every department has expert evaluators, and one of the things that we're very keen to promote is active live evaluation of every policy and programme that we do in government. So that's important, and it's a real skill. It's a very professional skill set. And the second thing is we've got these amazing communities of best practice and professional networks in government who get together to share learning all of the time. And of course we've got to celebrate and talk about it. The civil service isn't very good at talking about when we've got things wrong and what we've learned. We're not very good at celebrating when we get things right. So, we've got the Civil Service Awards, which is our annual event this evening, and I'm looking forward to celebrating a lot of our winners and some of the great things that they've done.
I mean, we've heard elsewhere that even within departments, there's a belief, well, we can't share this data between one directorate and another within the same department because of GDPR and all the rest of it. I mean, this is, what both of you are saying is compelling and common sense. But you've got the accountability frameworks, which organisations like the PAC take very seriously, which do not in any way, Chancellor, encourage or would countenance failure, because that's a big black cross next to your name and you're, shunned for eternity. So do you see changes to the framework to inculcate that? But how, between the mission boards aligned to civil service reform, do you turn around this oil tanker of risk averse, nothing can be allowed to fail, so either money is just pumped into it to keep the myth going of a work in progress? How do you change that culture of incentivization and risk when society is moving away from entrepreneurial risk-taking? I mean, you're almost trying to push the civil service and the machine in a way which the tide is flowing against.
I don't know that society is moving away from entrepreneurial risk-taking. Society likes the fruits of entrepreneurial risk-taking. There are companies that we use every day, Airbnb, Spotify, WhatsApp, didn't exist 20 years ago. They were all built on the basis of entrepreneurial risk-taking, and they have changed the way that we think about travel. They've changed the way that we consume music. When I started consuming music, I went to the record store and I bought a vinyl album and it had 12 records on it.
Is this when we have to say you don't look old enough?
And I played those 12 records, and I've been through all the iterations of cassette tapes. I showed my daughter some cassette
marvellous
tapes.
things.
She couldn't believe them. We then went through the world of CDs. Now we're in the world of single songs and playlists, and it's entrepreneurial risk-taking that took us there, and I could say the same.
No,
about
I take that point,
So-
but those are usually very small, fleet of foot, experts focused in a particular area, trying something different. Those are not the immediate words. I'm a huge fan of it, but those are not the immediate words which one would put your hand to when seeking to describe the organisation of the size, complexity and age, maturity, of the civil service and UK government.
Yeah, that's right. But what we're trying to do is say that when the world is changing so rapidly in the way that I've just talked about in terms of the consumption of music, in the private sphere, let's take some of the learning of that and apply that ingenuity and creativity and capacity to change to the public sphere too. It's not easy. It's not easy. I could give up. I could say,
don't do that.
It's not worth the effort. We'll just do everything the way we've always done it. And if you don't worry, you don't have to innovate, because if you never innovate, you've got no chance of failure. But I don't think that would be a very good
I agree.
way to run government.
I'm sure as a committee we will, as you would expect, monitor this and be interested to hear progress as the time goes by. I'm going to call Richard quickly. I'm then going to John Grady. I've got Michelle, Lauren, Richard, Marcus, Peter, anything? on this section? No, fine.
Well, yeah,
In which case, I shall put you, Peter, on the list. But let's turn to Richard quickly. Richard.
Thank you for everything so far. But taking it back to the very beginning, what excites you and therefore the country? What we should be excited about mission-led government as opposed to whatever led government we've had before?
No one's going to be excited by a label, but there's a serious point underneath this, which is, I believe, a loss of faith in the capacity of governments to deliver outcomes, because people have seen their tax burden rise, but there is a feeling that things don't work as well as they should. So waiting lists are longer, we don't build enough homes, and so on and so forth. So I prefer to think the label I care less about, but the outcome I do care about. And if we can get the system to really focus on the outcome and really drive for a better outcome in any of those fields that are in the plan for change that we published last week, then I think people will notice the outcome and will hopefully notice that these services that we're talking about are really trying to deliver for people. So I don't know whether you want to call that exciting. You could call it just, these services doing their job, but I think it's important. And I also believe the basics in politics and government are grossly underpriced, and people always want the new and the shiny and the exciting, but a health service that treats you in a decent time is a very good thing, and it shouldn't be underpriced or undervalued, and the same with the other public services that we're talking about.
Right, so in terms of the missions as well, it has to be cross-cutting, and we've talked about silos. So in terms of removing the silo aspect of a let's call it a project, what would success look like for you? So you could give us an example if you wish, but in terms of avoiding that silo handbrake.
Well, a lot of them do cut across departments. If you want children to have the best start in life, which is one of the things we talked about in the document, yes, that involves the Department for Education, but it also involves the Department for Health. It also involves making sure there are enough decent homes in the country for people who are growing up in a decent environment. It's more than one department, and that's true of most things here. So we're trying to encourage people to work together. I know this will sound a bit like a subjective point, but I think one of the fortunate things about the team of ministers that's come into government is that at cabinet level, certainly, it's pretty much the same team as was in the shadow cabinet. They've worked together for a few years. The team spirit is good. And so I think there are some good grounds for working together. But I am aware of the departmental DNA as well. It's a strong thing and it's a strong pool. This is not easy, but it's important if we want to get the right outcomes.
Agreed. And I suppose the last one, probably more for Ms Little, is we've got mission champions in our party, and I know you've got mission champions at senior level. Is there a consideration to put mission champions at the very low level of teams, so you've got this sort of mass of DNA, as it were, coming from the other end?
It's a great question. I mean, every single department has sort of taken forward their responsibilities for missions in the way that's most appropriate, and I know there are departments who have created mission focuses at every single level, and obviously some departments are more involved and others less so directly, so yes, but I don't think it will be a consistent one-size-fits-all.
Thank you.
And in these mission boards and all this, who arbitrates? Who is the final? Is it? I appreciate where the Prime Minister sits in the pyramid, but in that perennial battle of delivery between the Cabinet Office and the Treasury.
Who are the? I didn't.
Who has the whip hand? Because you'll have you're on all the mission boards, policies evolve, cross departmental working, etc. and everything's going hunky-dory, and then the happy faces of the Treasury come upon it, frown, wrinkle their noses, raise their eyebrows, and go, it's a lovely idea, but you have to wait for the spending review, or you have to wait for that, or we simply can't afford it, or we're not doing that, etc. Are you allowed to metaphorically shout at the Treasury? Not that one would shout at the Treasury, of course, but, you know.
The team spirit between us and the Treasury is very good. So there's been no need for any shouting.
You've said that with a wonderfully wry smile, Chancellor, so thank you for that. Richard, had you finished?
Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you. John Grady, then Michelle. John.
Yeah, thank you. An interesting thing you've said there was you pointed to a need for a greater emphasis on users of services and also on not having a cookie cutter approach and the need for regional, in my case as an MP for Glasgow East, different approaches across our family of nations. I mean, something that's long vexed me, wondered whether homelessness policy people speak enough to homeless people, and drug user policies, which is a big issue in my seat, is developed in consultation with drug users. Might be a good place to start. Could you talk us through a bit how you're going about involving users and the people who need to benefit from these improvements?
I think it's a very good point, and there are well-documented examples, if you take homelessness, of people bouncing around between different services, probably in a cumulative way, not getting a good outcome for themselves and costing an awful lot of money. There was a famous article written many years ago called $1 Million Murray about a homeless guy in Reno, Nevada, who was the example of this. And they worked out that for all the money being spent on Murray, they could have put him up in $1 million apartment rather than him bouncing around these services. So it's an international problem. And we have examples of people like $1 Million Murray here in the UK as well. So joining this up is really important. And that's what we're trying to do at a macro level through the mission work. But it's really important when you get to the service on the ground too.
I wonder, it might be a question for Kat as much as you. I wonder, Ms. Little, if you could give us some concrete examples of how you're going to go about that, or how the government go about that, where they see improvements could be made.
Well, every single part of Whitehall has really taken the challenge that the new government has brought to us, which is very, very clear. You need to consult, you need to engage end users, and we've got to diversify the way in which we develop policy. So we've done some of that in the past, so supporting families is a really good example of where there's been intensive user engagement. But when we look at some of the test and learn examples that the Chancellor spoke about, that is a good example where we're talking directly to end users in local places. So I won't go through all of the different locations that we're currently thinking about working with, but that team not only has people seconded from the front line in the team in the Cabinet Office, we are engaging with people directly on the front line.
Thanks.
Hi. The missions will require a localised approach if they're going to be successful, and for the government to be successful. So my first question is, how are devolved and local tiers of government and the private sector being incentivised to act in tandem with the government at the moment?
Really good question. So if you go through the different policy areas, some are reserved, some are devolved. If I take the example of energy, there are aspects of energy policy which are reserved, but there are also things like planning frameworks which are devolved in different parts of the country. The dialogue on this has been really good, actually, with between the UK government, Scottish government, Welsh government. Everybody knows there's a challenge for the country to move to clean power. Everybody wants to do it. I think it's been done in a really respectful way so far. On terms of the private sector, there is a lot of private sector investment in this field, and there's potentially more. When I went to Scotland in, I think it was October, for the first meeting of the Council of Nations and Regions, Scottish Power were announcing a doubling of their investment from 12 to 24 billion over the coming years. That wasn't money from the state, that's money from a private company going into clean energy. And the message from the industry to us is, if you can deal with the planning blockages and you can help us get connections to the grid, there will be more investment that wants to come in to the UK. So it isn't just a Department of Energy issue, it's an issue for all the different governing administrations throughout the UK and for the private sector too. And around the world, in this energy transition, most of the investment that's spent in different countries will come from the private sector. We believe in the state. This government does believe in the state having its front foot forward on this. That's why we established GB Energy, and we think there are certain technologies where some shared risk taking can help make a market and get things moving. We do believe in industrial policy. We don't believe that if you just leave everything to the market, it will work. But over the piece, even allowing for that quite, as I say, front-leaning posture, if you wish, most of the investment will come from the private sector.
I was very conscious the Treasury Minister's on his feet and votes are expected shortly. I presume we would all like to pause and go to vote when the bell rings.
Yes, we're in favour of.
I'm perfectly relaxed about it, but you see, Pat, it's the enthusiasm of the young which is driving us to do these things. Yeah. So let's just try and go through this. Michelle, had you finished on what you...
No, just
yes.
One more question. So do you think this? So really, thank you for the answer. This is slightly different, but kind of on the same course. So across the country, we have different elements of local government. We have mayors that are working really effectively. In Nottinghamshire, in some areas of Nottinghamshire, we have 3 tiers of local government. In some areas of Nottinghamshire, we have 2, for example. So again, it's going back to the effectiveness of being able to deliver those missions locally. In the past, under the previous Labour government, there was things like Pathfinder projects that Labour local authorities run out. So my question is, are the systems that are in place locally robust enough to deliver some of these things effectively? And could we run into a situation where there are some disparities between different parts of the country? So, for example, Greater Manchester has a mayor that seems to be going King of the North, etc., where some areas don't even have a mayor at the moment. So how do we tackle that in ensuring we achieve those missions across the country?
I'm not redesigning the whole of local government, but there is an English devolution white paper coming. There is an offer to parts of the country that don't have mayors to have them, but it's an offer. My own personal view is I think that elected mayors have been a successful project in the country. We started back when I was in government last time with the establishment of the London Mayor, the Greater London Mayor. You then referred to Manchester. I represent Wolverhampton in the West Midlands, where first under Andy Street and now Richard Parker, we've had 2 good people doing that. So I think it's personally a good model. Might not be for every part of the country, they might not want it, but I think these powerful voices have done well. So, I don't propose to redesign local government as part of this project, and the tapestry of the UK is varied, as you say. But I think when you think about these goals, most local authority leaders will want to do what they can to implement them in one way or another.
Well, I'd say as a former local government minister, the more unitaries and the more directly elected mayors we have, the better. Because it's much easier for Whitehall than Westminster to deal with, rather than this multi-layered mosaic that we have, as charming and delightful as it is. Peter, on the subject of charming and delightful.
Disagree on that point, Mr. Chair. On the matter of tests and learns, I've been reading your speech, very good speech while I've been in the room. Just to return to this point of tests and learns, I mean, I've often thought that local authorities are a very good example of this, with sort of 330 odd different models of trying to address the same problems across the country, and you can take what you want from the better of those and ignore the worse. But on the question of better or worse, the nature of a trial is that some things are going to get better and some things are going to get worse in places, and that raises the question of a postcode lottery with a lot of these. And my question really is, where does the democratic accountability lie? Because if a council messes up, you vote the council administration out, or you at least have that option where they failed your community. When it comes down to parts of the civil service and arm's length bodies, and I speak from experience as a former local government leader, where they get things wrong, and sometimes incredibly wrong, your only option is trying to beg and beg and beg for months for a meeting with a minister for 15 minutes, where you've got a million different directions, being pulled in a million different directions. You know, my question with a lot of these is, if we're going to be experimenting on bits of the country, where do those residents within those bits of the country get a say in that? Well,
these test and learn projects should involve residents. That's never a perfect thing to do, but they should be doing that. As I said earlier, this is about better things for citizens, so why wouldn't we want to do that? At the more macro level, the truth is, in a democratic system like the one that we have, if a department messes up, it'll be the minister who's in front of this committee or whatever the relevant select committee is in the House of Commons set up, and they'll be answering for it, and that's in the nature of our system, and that's always been the case.
I mean, sorry, but I accept that with any uniform policy that is a reasonable expectation, but in the case of where you get a particular difference in one locality from another locality, that seems to be diminishing the concerns of those particular localities that are disproportionately more affected than the rest of the country.
I mean, look, there is variation around the country at the moment, and we live with it. Some places have better bus services than others, and you know, that is it. I don't think I don't feel the need. This phrase about postcode lottery, it's always a tension, isn't it? You know, that if you can get something in one part of the country and you can't get it in another. And in the nature of devolving power, you will get difference. There's not much point in devolving power if you still want everything to be absolutely uniform. So I think if we're going to be a country that believes in devolving power, then that's a consequence. I still go on TV sometimes. 20 odd years, 25 years after the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senate have been established, and people say to me, don't you know that A happens in Scotland or doesn't happen in England or the other way around? What have you got to say about that? And so this was a great new discovery. And I say, well, actually, that is in the... I know this isn't the way you meant it, but it's in the nature of devolution. So if we devolve things, I think there's a... Is that our division, Bill?
I think that's a vote, yeah.
Maybe I better stop talking.
Well, we've got a minute. We've got 8 minutes to get down, haven't we? Or whatever it is. So we've got a few minutes.
We're all new.
Lauren, you wanted to come in.
Just very briefly, just on
give you a quick answer.
Yeah, on the outputs for the test and learn. Obviously, they're described as small projects at 6 to 12 months. I'm just wondering, are you envisioning them being sort of a quick win approach, or how deep are you expecting them to get into problems like temporary accommodation? Because obviously, if you look at that holistically, that can go right back to the problems of housing supply in the country.
Yes, it can, and they can't magic up more housing and properties. What I think they can do, forgive me, is look at how the available properties are used, look how long families are staying there. Is there a quicker way to move them into permanent accommodation? Is there a better way to use data? Are they getting the right services when they're in there? You've often got vulnerable families living in accommodations you wouldn't want to live in for a long time. So I think there's a number of questions they can look at without getting a magic wand out and saying, right, we're going to produce X more houses in this area over the next 6 months. I mean, we do want to build more houses, but that's a longer term project. Mr. Chairman, I'm in your hands, but
no,
I think the mood of the meeting is they want to go and
let's
vote.
suspend. I think, colleagues, there are at least 2 votes, I think, now. So we won't come backwards and forwards in between votes. I think we'll just might as well just stay down, do them both, and Chancellor, are you happy to come back?
Yeah, that's fine.
exam question is, it is very difficult. So we've had multiple meetings since then, and up to the Prime Minister. The Chancellor so far has refused to engage.
Can I be explicitly clear that in you saying that you're saying that if the government says there's no U-turn, that you haven't come forward with a solution to make this a better policy? Is that what you're saying?
We have all written, all of the organisations represented today have written to the Prime Minister asking for a pause and a consultation. I think this is such a complicated area. There are many ways of making the policy less bad, but a full consultation will hopefully arrive at the right solution rather than a less bad solution.
Understood. Thank you. Victoria?
I think we've probably had all the meetings that are on the list of people you ought to meet immediately of having given them bad news. What I feel the problem has been is that we've had long meetings and no sense whatsoever that any listening is happening. You know, we are talking about the outcomes, we're talking about the long-term effects on the industry, we're talking about the effects on individuals, and everybody nods and smiles and no sense of any listening. And that's why this is such a really helpful inquiry to sit in on, actually. We can argue till the cows come home about the 500 and the 70,000, but if there's no acceptance of the assumption that we're muddling up business assets with personal wealth in this move, and therefore you are going to end up attacking an industry and people's businesses, and that's completely unnecessary.
Understood. And you had the same question that I asked Tom. If are your recommendations based on trying to improve the policy that's been put forward rather than advocating for a U-turn? And if it is the former, what recommendations have you put forward that you felt need to be heard?
Well, the first thing is the pause. Let's stop and think. Let's not just crash forwards, hoping against hope that this will turn out to be, it'll turn out all right or it'll turn out differently. We agree with the two other associations represented here. A pause to really consider whether there should be a full U-turn and a different approach to agricultural property relief and business property relief. If it's a loophole, HMRC has everything it has in its power to change or close that loophole. And between us, we could find a great many ways of doing that. But this is not the answer to that question. So, in a way, what you're asking is, you've got two questions there. Should we stop? Yes. Should we have a consultation? Yes. But one of those questions, the important questions, is, was this the right thing to do in the first place? Could we actually all be a bit cleverer about this?
Thank you. Robert?
It's the unintended consequences of the tenant sector that's my concern. The evening of the budget, we met with Daniel Zeigner, and we explained to him in words of one syllable the effect that is going to happen. We're going to see shorter-term tenancies, risk-averse landlords, and we're going to see notices to quit, to free land, to sell, to pay tax. You've already heard from one of your other evidence providers today about the fact that they see in the tenant sector, and there is a huge concern with me. You've also heard today regarding the estates that are not affected, the church, the Crown, the Duchy, the Trust, being charitable statuses, the colleges. So we have the private landlords who have been long-term letters of land for hundreds of years. They still want to let land, but if they're going to be affected by the tax implication, then they will have to make the land vacant possession, and tenants will lose their livelihoods.
Yeah, understood. Thank you.
Tonya.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that's been very clear, especially when we took evidence from with the Northern Ireland Select Committee yesterday, that this is having a huge impact on the well-being of our agricultural communities. I was just wondering what measures you have noticed. What have you noticed about the concerns of farmers and the increase in the concerns? Is it impacting on their mental health? Tom?
I mean, it's very clear. The examples that I'm being sent through are often from what I would say middle-aged farmers concerned about their parents or parent that doesn't believe they have 7 years able to plan. And the awful, unacceptable position that those individuals have been put in. Because somebody said earlier on they haven't taken advice. That's completely wrong. A lot of these people have spent the very best money on tax planning advice, and until the Chancellor sat down, the correct advice was to keep the farm until death. Now they don't have any way to plan through that, and yet they've given everything to producing the food for this country in that period post-Second World War. They really deserve a lot more respect than they have been given by the changes that are proposed. And I am going to talk about the most severe human impacts, which we believe could end up being triggered by this, which is that those people who genuinely are either in ill health or don't believe that they are going to be able to live for 7 years may well decide that they shouldn't be here on April 26. Now, no policy should ever be published that has that unintended side effect. Now, what I'm being told by some people is, well, money doesn't trigger this. And I may agree with them that money doesn't trigger it, but it's not money. This is a lifetime of work. It's the heritage. And the custodianship of that farm.
Anybody else come in at this point to perhaps touch?
I think we have very good support in some ways, which is why we know about this. It's not just personal anecdotes. The auction marts run a very, very supportive system of making sure that people who are not just concerned about themselves can report in. Mm-hmm. So, you can pick up leaflets, you know who to call. We've got a system in Cornwall which, in fact, was first picked up by the health inspectors, because the first thing they know is when somebody phones in because there are dead sheep lying in the fields. That's when they know there's a problem. And they go in and they go to visit and they discover, yes, there's terrible potential for suicide, but also that is on top of a pile of other human pain. Abuse in the family, children not going to school. This is a big problem which finally manifests itself sometimes in that last push. For the next generation issues, we just are saying to everybody to say to your oldies, you've been our tall trees, now we're going to be yours. And that's the best you can do. But, you've had it in your discussions in the House recently about end of life. And the fact of the matter is the nicest, most forbearing, most family-conscious people will go, oh, you could do without me. Whereas the real brutes never think that. So I think it will be those severe cases, but it'll be I think now all I'm going to add is that this is a pebble in a pool to businesses that come out from that business at the centre. We are all employing other people who are all employing people. So it's not just that one thing.
Thank you.
Andrew, you wanted to come in at this point?
Yeah, just come in on a couple of questions. Firstly, Tom, I hope you hear from us as a committee the respect we have for yourself and farmers, which is why we're holding this inquiry and want to be able to look at it and shine a light on it from different angles, because that's all of us, I think, on the committee commitment to do that and to do that to the best of our ability. Can I just tease out a couple of questions just to see if you understand the panel, some of the motivation where government's at, and that might allow us to reflect on where the journey is they're trying to get to. So firstly, I think I've heard, I just want to confirm, do you all recognise the government's view there is a loophole, or that something, you recognise you're not against any change, you're not happy with this change?
I'd start by saying this is an unmeasured effect. I like to know data, and I'll always go back and say, find me the number. Is this a perceived problem? Because actually, I'd quite like to buy that land, and somebody else has come in and paved over the odds for it, and that's only happened once in 20 miles around me. Or is this a persistent problem? My grandfather bought a farm. He's a perfectly legitimate farmer. So somebody has to be buying into this system, and they're going to need assets to do that. So I think it's a simplification. However, if there is a loophole, I have every confidence in the advice of this committee and the advice of the Treasury being able to close that loophole, as far as it's necessary, you know, for everybody to have a clear conscience about it. But that doesn't mean people shouldn't be buying farms.
Absolutely. Look, and I say that particularly because when the CLA came to see me before the budget and this was on the table, the CLA position given to me was that no change whatsoever was necessary. So now we seem to be discussing different where change could be necessary.
Well,
is it the CLA position?
I'm trying to bend to your position, actually. Yeah. This is me being forbearing, but also our position has always been, if you think there's a problem with APR, let's talk about the problem. Mm-hmm. Let's not just go swinging in there, getting rid of it. And I think it's a mistake in farming to talk about APR without talking about BPR, as the last group was saying, because a lot of the assets, you know, will come under BPR, the stock, for example, in a dairy and the machinery and so on. So nothing is perfect. Everything can do with being improved, you know. We are none of us perfect. Mm-hmm. So, and I just want to reiterate Tom's really good point at the beginning. It grates a bit with all of us to be told that we haven't done any tax planning. We did our tax planning. It was called agricultural property relief and business property relief, and we've structured businesses around those reliefs to make them multi-generational businesses. So it feels a little bit condescending when they say, poor souls, you know, they didn't do any planning.
My question was, you accept some change could happen, but not the
usefully,
change.
Yes.
Okay.
Could I just draw our attention, please, Andrew, to a comment that was made in by the Office of Tax Simplification report in 2019. It is generally understood that the main policy rationale for BPR and APR is to prevent the sale or breakup of businesses or farms to finance inheritance tax payments following the death of the owner. Mm-hmm. I still think that statement is absolutely true. And any change to APR or BPR should be on personal wealth and should be affordable rather than being on business wealth. So that is where the suggestions in the earlier panel around making sure that there is available assets to pay the tax probably lead you to a very different proposal to the one that's on the table. And so I think, again, this is where consultation would really help with the experts, because I think it is perfectly possible that out of a grown-up consultation, government may be very surprised at the solutions that can be come up with. But I think what's clear today with the proposal that's been made in the budget is that there is a desire from this government to change where we are today. Mm-hmm. So our position is, let's work with you to get to an outcome that works for all, rather than the blunt instrument we have today.
To add on that, really, if the loophole supposedly was to stop money coming in from outside of agriculture and buying land up, they still have left rollover relief in place. So they really haven't stopped that at all. Mm-hmm. And that's my concern about that one.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you. And the government said, if the government was here, they would be saying this is about all sectors need to contribute, and they're trying to do it fairly. They would say all sectors need to contribute because they're trying to repair public services. Have you done any modelling? Have you got any data you could share for us about what's, you know, the impact of what changes need to happen in those public services in rural areas, and any alternative funding you'd have to put into those?
Oh, that's a big question. Fortunately, we have produced a paper with the All-Party Parliamentary Group a couple of years about the rural economy and about how to reinforce and grow the rural economy. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of weaknesses in the public services. It's not, unfortunately, just down to buses. So I take it a little bit amiss. We do pay our taxes. We are talking about capital taxes here, not the fact that we're paying our income tax, we're paying our VAT, we're paying our staff, we're paying their national insurance contributions. We are contributing. Mm-hmm. This is not a sector that is not, and by the way, trundling out a whole fat load of food at the same time, which we are forced to sell at less than market price. So, you know, it's not like we're not contributing. I think that's crept into the dialogue, which I sometimes feel it shouldn't have. Whether or not what we could contribute which is not very much money. I think it's been associated as a day and a quarter of the NHS is the annual takeout from this particular tax. Is the candle worth the flame? You know, is it worth ruining an entire industry for 1.25 days of the NHS? You know, I think Mr. Streeting might suggest that he'd like some more help with changing the NHS.
My question was, I was more interested in, have you identified other routes that would raise money to put into public services in rural areas if it wasn't this?
Yes. And it's a long document, and I'd be more than happy to send it to you. But the best way to improve this sector is to grow. Help us to invest, help us to grow our businesses. And we have the capacity, because we lag behind the urban areas in terms of productivity, we have the capacity to add 40 billion to the GVA of this country. And funnily enough, that was the sum she was looking for. So don't kill us, let us fight our way out of this corner.
I think the other really important thing is that ever since the Second World War, there's been a covenant between farming and government, that farming gets on and does its job of producing food. And it's never really been about the returns. It's been about that way of life, that heritage, that custodianship. And unfortunately, with other changes in the budget, along with this one, it feels like that covenant has been broken. And we are, with the food we're producing, at very, very low returns, supporting the whole of society. And how much more do we need to support society? And let's get to a point where we're paying those taxes through the food we're producing, through getting fair market returns. And there were some interesting elements in the manifesto which could have answered some of those challenges around standards of imports and fairness in the supply chain and public procurement. And let's get them in place so that we are a profitable sector which is driving reinvestment and really delivering for food security, rather than looking at how we generate a little bit more tax income to rebuild our rural services.
Right. I'm keen that we move on at this stage, but John, you've got a very quick intervention.
Just very quickly on process, pre-budgets, you wouldn't normally expect to speak to Treasury ministers, would you? I mean, was it unusual the way that the run-up to the budget was conducted, do you think?
I mean, we will always write to the Chancellor pre-budget and ask for a meeting, and it's down to the Chancellor as to whether she would like in this case.
I'm trying to be fair to this government, in that on fiscal measures, you wouldn't expect to have a dialogue before a budget, would you?
I don't think I was critical. I just said that we hadn't met. There was an offer to meet from us, and the Chancellor decided not to take that. Now, if there was going to be a big change that was going to impact our sector, maybe somebody from Treasury would have had a call or a meeting.
Tom, you were reported to have met with the Prime Minister, and it was reported that he had indicated there would be a softening in the approach. Do you have any observations about that report?
What was reported, I don't think it was that there was necessarily, but it was that he was very much listening. And it is a private meeting, and I'm not going to break the trust of that meeting. But what I would say is I felt that the Prime Minister had a far better understanding of the unintended consequences by the end of the meeting than he did at the start of the meeting. But I'm very surprised that as yet we haven't had any firm action on the back of the meeting.
Okay. Right, I am going to move on, but you touched there, Tom, on an area where I think it's appropriate. We should remember, actually, our proceedings are seen well beyond the confines of Westminster. We're being broadcast, and that much of what we are talking about will have a very direct and human impact on those who are watching our proceedings today. The clerks will arrange for links to relevant support for anybody who feels affected by the evidence they've heard today on our committee social media channels, should anybody require to avail themselves of that. Josh.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to start by echoing Andrew's thanks for coming and being really frank with us. A number of us are on the NFU's parliamentary scheme, and I think we're really looking forward to exploring all these issues around the future of farming outside of London. Very much looking forward to that. But just for the benefit of our inquiry, could I ask both you, Tom and Victoria, just to put on record the assessment you've made of the number of farms that might be affected by this and how you arrived at those figures?
We haven't actually published a number of farm businesses. When we have looked at the Treasury data, we've used OBR or previous OBR experts to model this with us. When we take off the long tail, which was being talked about earlier on, we get to 75% of commercial farms that are caught in the eye of this storm. And when I go back to that definition earlier on that I read out from the Office for Tax Simplification, it doesn't talk anywhere there about protecting small businesses. And I think that somehow we have ended up in a place where we think that small businesses should be protected, or this is a government policy, rather than looking at the wider impact of not protecting the wider group of businesses. So we believe 75% of commercial farms that are producing this country's food will be impacted with, or will be within the scope of the change. Now, unfortunately with this, it's a bit of a game of roulette that you never know when your time is coming and whether you are one of the 500 or not. But everyone has to prepare not to be in that number. And that means life insurance, it means pension contributions, and it means extremely expensive professional fees from lawyers. But that cash does not exist within the business. And any cash that was there previously was being reinvested in food production for the future. Instead, now it's going to have to be taken out of the business on those life products and that advice. And it just doesn't seem like that is how we deliver food security and productivity gains for the future.
Sorry?
Well, I'm going to what he said, and also the figures that we worked through are in the region of 70,000 holdings affected. That's because we're taking the same generational view. We don't know when we're going to go, but also, just as an aside to that, which was covered this morning, is we don't know the order in which we're going to die. You know, it's just not given to us to understand that particular part of the plan. And therefore, we could take a lot of very expensive advice. In fact, I am going to see my lawyer this afternoon to take said expensive advice and for it to be completely thrown out. So there's no guarantee that the expensive advice you take is going to work. The life insurance, I did think that at his end of life, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, life insurance probably seemed quite cheap. But from my end of life insurance is no longer a cheap option. It would be an expensive option. And as we've said, that would probably have stopped us. DJ Bray are just installing heating in our event space as we speak. That would be instead of. At every point, this will be instead of. The professional advice keeps being covered. But also, I think one of the mistakes that I would like to correct from this morning was that the bank would be happy to lend us money to pay tax. Banks don't lend money to pay tax. It's written quite clearly on all their loan stuff. That's not what they do, because there's a big chance that they're not going to get it back. So over the period, we reckoned in the old sense of calculated at 70,000. The NFU and the CAAV have reckoned it slightly higher than that. A margin of error still leaves a huge number.
And just in terms of, you mentioned holdings, right? So is that based on holding numbers? Because we know that often one farm can have a number of holding numbers. So
I think I meant it in the terms of business.
Right, okay.
From business.
Okay, thank you for that. Because I think obviously there's this big public debate around the figures, and what we're, I think, as a committee trying to drill down into is how many farms are going to be affected rather than estates. So why do you think there is that disagreement on the figures? And, how can you help us, I suppose, get to that point where we're really talking about businesses being affected as opposed to just, the number of estates for sort of tax purposes?
We can't argue the historic Treasury figures. They are an accurate snapshot of what happened in 2021-22. And I think there has been probably language that even I may have used at times, which has suggested those figures are inaccurate. I think they do misrepresent, but they're not inaccurate. So I think that is something that we should be conscious of. But when the figure came out, 73% of the states won't be affected. That is, when we look at our members' businesses, that is where we have the biggest disagreement, because we believe that 75% of commercial farm businesses will be affected. Now, you don't know if you're impacted, as I've already said, until you know when the time comes that you would be in the eye of this. So I think that probably the other thing is obviously with land price inflation, there is that's in double-digit inflation over the past few years. So that means that the number of estates coming into this will be bigger. But also, if you look at when the 100% relief came in 1992. A lot of estates over the decade post 1992 will have, they may have already been tax planning in place pre 92. Post 92, the advice will have been keep the farm asset until death. Now, many of those estates will be getting to a point now, 30 years later, where they are now moving into that period where the owners of those estates could well be in that age, sort of in the twilight of their careers. And that is the area now where I think it's very difficult to ascertain what that profile looks like, but there will be a significant number in there whose planning now was to keep the asset until death, and that would have from 30 years ago.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Victoria or Robert, before I move on?
Yeah. Whereas the landowners are trying to plan to sort it through, I already have estates in my area who have an inherent tax liability, and they've already given notice to quit the tenants. And some of those people have no idea whether they'll have a roof over their head next week, next year, wherever it's going to be. So the impact is now. And you mentioned before, how do you meet the Treasury? We meet the Treasury 3 or 4 times a year, because part of what we've said as an organisation is we need to see a slight change in the tax rules. So if you have exemption on inheritance tax for 10 years, but you're prepared to let the land for 10 years and you get the exemption on the tax, that will help to secure the land for the generation within the tenant sector.
Is that Treasury Ministers or officials that you're meeting there?
Both. We were in Downing Street, George Dunn and myself, before the budget and also after the budget, before to say we see what would happen if you do this, and then we told them what was going to happen by the changes they had made.
Okay.
Just one follow-up question on that. One of the things that's been talked about a lot is that the biggest sort of financial liability for this would fall on the largest estates, and that's been cited as a reason why it's kind of fair in that sense. But do you have a sense of how many of those large estates are actually made up of many smaller tenanted farms? Because I think that's one of the sort of arguments, particularly you're making, Robert, isn't it, that these large estates actually are made up of a lot of smaller
it is. In the turn of the year, when the notices were put into these tenants, we held a meeting and we had 60 tenants in the room who were going to be affected by this. And at that point, the estate was talking about a Balfour partnership, and that was working really well until the budget, and Balfour doesn't work now. Mm-hmm. So we said to them, would you support us to try to go back to Treasury to get the exemption for the 10 years plus? It was 8 years in ROC, the review, of course. And they said, well, if you can get us this exemption, they said, well, we're left for 20 years. Mm-hmm. These people have let land for hundreds of years, for long term, 3 or 4 generations of the same family on the same estate. I was the 3rd generation on my estate, but my landlord was a charity, so they're not affected by this. But we have large landowners who have let for years and held historic land masses, and all they want to do is let the land.
I think, could I just add to that, as a large number of our members who are letting land are not letting 40 tenancies. They're letting 2 or 3. That's the majority of them will have 2 or 3 or 4 tenants, and it'll be a mixture of Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies and new FBTs and so on. One thing that hasn't come up is that in these new circumstances, they are going to be liable for their business property relief, and they don't have an asset that they can easily sell to fulfil that obligation. It's certainly true that if there's the first payment is due within 6 months of death, so you can't wait until somebody dies and then start faffing around trying to free up land to sell so that you can pay that first charge. And if you miss that first charge, you pay 9% interest on it. you know, and then that clock really starts to tick. You know, people start to panic. They start to panic about missing the next one. We both sit on the Farm Tenancy Forum, which was established a year ago as a result of the ROC review, and it's been a really great force for collaboration and good between the landlord and tenant sector. I cannot recommend it enough, and I don't think we all went into it thinking that, actually. Yeah, but so I want to support all that Robert says, really, in terms of probably one of the biggest unforeseen consequences of this will be in the tenanted sector.
Right, which leads us quite nicely on, Eleanor, to your questions.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to, given the discussion so far and conscious of time, I'm going to combine the sections, Chair. Yeah. So can I just begin by echoing my colleagues' comments to place on record our thanks to the farming community, the hard work that everybody in the rural community does day in, day out to put food on our table. And we really appreciate that. And I think as a committee, we are very much agreed that as well as looking at this issue in hand today, as a committee, we are determined to look at the wider profitability of the farming sector and the issues that there have been for many years and if not decades building up, affecting farmers and the wider community. We've touched briefly on tenant farmers. Robert, I just wanted to ask you about the impact of some of these changes on tenant farmers, and specifically the link with, we talked in the previous evidence session about the fact that over half of those who qualify for APR under the current Treasury figures, which I think nobody's disputing, have not received any income from farming in the last 5 years. So what would be your assessment of those 56% who have qualified for APR but not received any income from farming? What proportion are currently renting out their land to tenant farmers?
I would have thought the vast majority will be, because they won't be just having land sitting doing nothing, because there are schemes available via the government for whether you have a tenant on or whether you are planting trees, whether you've got fallow, whether you've got legume layers. You're not going to just have it sitting dormant, because land goes backward very, very quickly unless it's invested in.
And so I think you've expressed some concerns that with these changes there might be a smaller pool of land available for tenant farmers. Yes. Who do you see buying up that land instead? Would it be other landlords that would then lease the land? Or?
I'm sure if people have got the rollover relief available to them. We've also got, in my area, we've quite a lot of building going on, so people selling land for development and then reinvesting back into that land again. And there was talk, well, if the land comes back in value, well, the tenants can buy it. Well, it's just not going to happen. It's really not going to happen, because there is more of a return for the tenant on his investment than there is for the owner-occupier on their investment. Thomas said people do for the generation. I have a rent to pay, so I have to do for the profit. And that's because if I don't pay the rent, I'm out.
And there's been some reference to the ROC review into the tenant farming sector, and I know that obviously the government is committed to implementing those recommendations. Have you seen any progress since that review in your sector in terms of those being moved forward under the previous government? And what would be your top recommendations to progress with speed from that review affecting tenant farmers?
Well, Victoria's also already mentioned about the Tenant Farm Forum, which is working really well. We now have the Code of Conduct in place, but why you'd have to have a Code of Conduct to tell people how to behave, I do not know. We have a Tenant Farm Commissioner where the will hopefully be in place by the spring of next year. And I've already reiterated this about the fact of the fourth part was to get exemption from inheritance tax if the landlord lets for 10 years plus. Well, it was 8 years in ROC, but the Tenant Farmers Association have been asking for about 10 to 15 years for 10 years, because if I've got long-term tenure, then I'm prepared to invest. And if you have a well-invested holding for the tenant, it's also a well-invested holding for the landlord as well. Because I am a custodian, as Tom has already said. And if I don't look after the land won't look after me, and I won't be able to generate a profit. And profit may be a very dirty word, but but the profit allows me to spend 80% of my income within 30 miles of my business. So I'm supporting the local community, the people that work for me, their children go to the local school, the local village hall, and the whole community that is based around the rural community. Because if I look at what my landlord did back in the day, back in the 1800s, they built a village hall, they built a church, and they were the glue that held the community together.
Thank you. You referenced about profit. I don't think anyone on this committee would think profit was a dirty word, but we are very aware of how the farming sector has become less profitable in recent years. I know we've seen 12,000 farms close in the last decade. I just wondered if the panellists could comment on what they see as the main drivers of that in the last decade. What has been the biggest problems for farmers?
I'll leave Tom very much to talk about profitability. I'm just going to talk a bit about why land holdings are growing. I think we have to be very careful not to look at that and see that that's a bad thing always. For example, one of our members brought together 3 hill farms to make one farm that was a really viable farm for new entrants to come into and equip that farm. There's a big difference between equipped farms and what is referred to as bare land. So I think the tide of history is also running through this. I think we're getting larger holdings developing because people need to make a living. So I think we need to put that background behind it. For tenants, it might seem ultimately that there are fewer tenancies, but that might be because those tenancies can now really make a living. And I think we need to be really careful at thinking that necessarily fewer farms means a lot of other people have brought in. There might be all kinds of reasons. The question about who's going to buy the land, the first person who's going to want to buy the land is the person who lives next door, because everybody says you only get one chance to buy the fields on the edge of your farm. Mm-hmm. And that inflates prices, because you will pay almost anything to make sure that you get hold of that land. And we haven't really stuck enough on the new landowners. The new landowners might well be, people say corporates, but that might be a family farm that's been told to incorporate. It's a bit of a broad term. Also, the charities are much, much bigger in this sector, the wildlife trusts. The wildlife trusts are being funded as a charitable sector, but also sometimes funded, by the Environment Agency, for example, to buy land. So it's a much, much more complicated picture, and that's why it's great that you have the time to listen to that.
Just before I bring in Tom on the wider sector issues, you touched on that issue around who is owning the land. If you look at the top 10 recipients of subsidies from DEFRA in recent years, many of the people on that list often are a surprise. Colleges, for example, Oxbridge colleges, or huge multinationals. Do you think that's right? And do you think that the way subsidies have been given out in recent years has incentivised the right kind of actors in the farming industry?
We have very much supported the movement into environmental land management, because after leaving the European Union, the CLA felt very strongly that it would be almost impossible to sit next to somebody on that old Clapham omnibus and explain that you were being paid by the acre, because it would seem necessarily to favour people with more acres. And so the word subsidy to all of us is an old-fashioned word. We don't get subsidised. We get paid by contract to deliver public goods for the government and therefore for the people of the United Kingdom. And that's been a really healthy change. So, yes, and also big isn't necessarily bad. In terms of feeding 65 million people, you need scale. You don't get 180-acre sugar beet farms. It just doesn't happen. The economics don't work out like that. So big isn't always bad. And I think the more commitment that we see from government about pushing forward environmental land management at speed is going to be vital for the success of the sector. But on profitability, Tom is the expert.
Well, Victoria, you've led into that beautifully, because I even have severe questions about the profitability of the environmental land management scheme, if I'm honest with you. And I think that is something that probably deserves an inquiry in itself, but that's not for me to decide. But I mean, the public money for public goods is now a simple contract between farming and government to deliver those services that the public require, and it's not a support payment, and people will do it if they think they can generate profit out of it. Look, there are so many challenges around profit. I think don't underestimate. When I was in the US back in September, and over there they said you've got the most competitive retail sector in the world. And that is the crux of this issue, is that food inflation hasn't kept up with real terms inflation for the last 40 or 50 years. We spend less than 10% of disposable income on average. Now, I know that's widely variable, but on average on food, and we're not getting the returns from the food that's being produced for the risk that goes into it. That is another reason that this change to policy is not affordable. And I think that is, the affordability of the change to IHT is something that it should be absolutely central to it. And at the moment, we don't believe farms can afford to pay the tax bill. Import standards is another one that I think is very, very important when we look at the ability of the market to function. I draw your attention to poultry, particularly broiler production, where I think that all we're doing, we're lowering our stocking density here in the UK, so raising our standards without the ability to build new sheds. We're drawing in imports from Poland, Thailand and Brazil that are produced to worse standards than we are currently producing to. I mean, what's the rationale in that? So we need to look at what stops the market functioning properly in economic terms, and so that we can get to the bottom of this. But I think that's probably for another day rather than today.
And one of the big issues that's been raised with me by a local farm in my constituency who were farming potatoes for hundreds of years, growing potatoes for hundreds of years, and then have stopped last year, is the big supermarkets. They simply cannot compete in the way that the big supermarkets are running their procurement and the prices that they are paying for things, and that is being a death knell. One of my farmers described it to the industry.
So the competitive of our retail sector was exactly what I would highlighted, and they purchase a lot of our production. So look, this is something that I think we all need to, as an industry, say where do we want to be in 10 years' time, and what does sustainable production look like, and what reinvestment is required to get there, and how do we deliver that? And so that it's an incredibly competitive sector where many of our members do not get the returns and cannot pass the cost increases in. Now, this budget, beyond APR and BPR, hugely inflationary food production with national insurance and national living wages. Our horticultural sector, the intensive sectors, are really, really concerned that they're not going to be able to pass on those increased costs.
Would you welcome changes in the area of the big supermarkets and how they conduct themselves?
Look, I just think it's too simple to say yes or no to that, because I think there is room for looking at that, but I don't think that solves the question we're here really looking at today.
And just finally, you didn't touch on energy prices and the impact that's had. Has that been a big issue?
I'm very nervous about the energy market.
Obviously, this impacts on the wider profitability of the sector, but we are under pressure of time, and I'm keen to keep it focused if we can for the moment. And I do have to bring in Charlie Hilmer. So, Charlie, can I?
Thank you. Victoria, you sort of alluded to that, the pebble in the pond, and the impact money that is taken out of the sector is then not spent on businesses. But BPR also affects people who are not farmers, other businesses in the rural economy, the rural community. Do you want to shed very briefly, because we're about to go to PMQs, but the impact that might have on other businesses surrounding the farmers?
I see that everybody's at the centre of a different web in the way the rural commercial kind of community works. We're a web of direct employment. So therefore, we're contributing by employing people, and they are going off and spending their available cash where they can. But we're also a web of indirect employment. I referred to Braze, I've referred to all of these people who we form a very small part of their annual turnover, but while we have the money to invest, that is all of us are all of their turnover. We are the people, and they too are having that effect. So what happens when we get a big tax bill? First thing, we look at direct employment. Who can we do without? And that's going to be more and more. It's going to be. It's very hard to do without people who actually do things. So it's quite hard to replace the doers. But it's not so hard now to replace, the administrative staff or all of those things that are built around. And maybe that's just the shape of the future. But the first place we'll look is direct employment. And the second thing will be the indirect. Which projects have we got phased in for next year, which we're now not going to even consider? Because, not necessarily because of inheritance tax, God willing, but because, of all of the other pressures, and also, as you were saying earlier, needing to put aside money to make allowances for this big change of direction. So, and I haven't ever really lived, apart from when I was at university, in a big urban conurbation. So I perceive, now I'm here a lot, that they have those same relationships. I think that perhaps they're more stark in a rural area because there isn't somewhere else to go for that employment. If we let somebody go, they won't get it. Yep.
Bring us back on to John. You had a
just a lot of things have been mentioned about profitability. You could talk about capital grants. The previous government didn't get the capital grants out quickly enough. You've got uncertainty over the land use framework. You've got the thresholds and the national insurance changes, etc., etc. But to try and get to the heart of this issue for today, how important, and the distribution of value across the supply chain for supermarkets, but if you had to sort of prioritise in terms of what you'd want from the government, in terms of things they need to fix most, the state says he wants more profitability. How would you put this APR BPR issue in terms of the priority that you need to be fixed? There's so many things, as there always are, for government to deal with.
No, I think this is very easy because if we went back to the 30th of October, it wasn't on the agenda. Let's remove this from the agenda while we fix the other problems. And that's the challenge, is that we've brought another problem into the sphere of challenges the farming industry is facing. We know the industry needs to make huge investment over the next decade to meet our environmental mitigation responsibilities. This takes cash that should be going to be invested in the future of our businesses to mitigate environmental risk. How it's a joined-up policy delivering food security when food security is being recognised as part of our national security, this just seems to be a distraction. And it's a rounding error in the budget. It's not that it's going to raise a significant amount of money. So I really think that this is a policy that can be removed without, and it's not bringing anything till 2027 anyway. So it feels like it's something that could be removed, consulted on, and we can remove this as an issue.
Based on all the other things that you need to...
All the other priorities, yeah. There's so many other priorities which were already on a burning platform, and then we've added something else to the pot. And
Victoria, Robert, do you agree with Tom's assessment?
Well, I suppose at the moment, if you look back over the years, every government has had a cheap food policy. And they've put the, if you call them a subsidy in place to mitigate that. Most people that I deal with would much rather get no payment from government, take it from the supermarket or from the consumer, because I don't have my plumber, my electrician saying, well, it's only so much an hour and then I'm going to get a top of the government. And that doesn't work. Whereas for me, if my milk price or my beef price isn't down, then there's a payment comes in to mitigate that. But as we've already mentioned about food security, but it's only in my father's generation that they remember rationing, and I'm very concerned that ministers are making decisions on a full stomach at the moment. And that's my concern.
I'm going to take that one.
Right, okay. On this point, though, we have reached midday. It may be that members' attention will now focus elsewhere in this building. So we're very grateful to you for your attendance, for your evidence today. We shall take further evidence and consider our reports. But thank you for your attendance. We are most grateful. Order, order.